The mountain man thought no one wanted him, until little black twins whispered, "Be our daddy." Alone in a cabin high in the storm-beaten mountains, he had nothing left but silence, until two shivering children knocked on his door. One night of kindness was supposed to send them safely back to town, but their plea pierced his heart and turned his life upside down. Now, in a land ruled by prejudice and fear, he stands against ranchers, lawmen, and even the courts, fighting for children the town swears he can never call his own. When sickness strikes and the boy's life hangs by a thread, the old hermit must risk everything, his safety, his soul, and even his last breath, to keep them alive. In a world that said he was unwanted, could the love of two orphans prove everyone wrong? And when the church bell tolls, will the town finally see him as a father, or try to tear them apart forever? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The sleet drummed against Silas Boone's cabin like angry fists, each icy pellet a reminder of his solitude. Inside, the old mountain man sat in his worn leather chair, working the whetstone against his hunting knife with slow, methodical strokes. The blade's edge caught the firelight, throwing orange gleams across the rough-hewn walls. "Ain't nobody out there to care," he muttered to himself, his voice rusty from disuse. The words dissolved into the crackle of burning pine logs. "Wouldn't matter none if I just froze right here in this chair." His weathered hands, marked with the scars of 30 years in the mountains, moved automatically across the steel. The familiar rhythm brought him back to younger days, when his fingers had been nimble enough to set the most delicate trap, when his heart had been open enough to love. He remembered Morning Flower's smile, how her dark eyes had sparkled like sun on water, but her people had rejected him, and his own kind had sneered at their love. The memory stung worse than the bitter wind howling outside. The knife's edge gleamed perfect now, sharp enough to split a hair. Silas set the stone aside and tested the blade with his thumb, remembering how Morning Flower had taught him to listen to the steel's song. "A good knife speaks true," she'd said, but that had been before the prejudice, before the walls of hatred had risen between them, before. A knock at the door jolted him from his brooding. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in his fortress of solitude, that at first he dismissed it as a trick of the storm. But it came again, lighter this time, more desperate, the pounding of small fists against wood. Silas rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. The knife gleamed in his hand as he approached the door. In all his years up here, no one had ever come calling on a night like this. He'd chosen this spot precisely because it was too remote, too difficult to reach. The nearest settlement was 15 miles away, across terrain that would challenge even an experienced woodsman. The knocking came again, weaker now. Something in its fading urgency made his hand move faster to the latch. The wind howled in as he yanked the door open, bringing with it a swirl of ice and two small, dark figures. They stood huddled together in the snow, a boy and a girl no more than 7 years old. Their clothes, city clothes not meant for mountain weather, were soaked through. Their small bodies shook with cold, their faces lifted to him in desperate hope. Both had rich brown skin and eyes that seemed too old for their young faces. "Please, mister," the girl whispered through chattering teeth. "It's so cold." The boy's arm was wrapped protectively around his sister's shoulders. "We saw your smoke," he managed. "Please." Silas stood frozen for a moment, the knife still in his hand. Every instinct honed by years of solitude screamed at him to shut the door, to return to his quiet existence. But something else, something he'd thought long dead, stirred in his chest. "Lord Almighty," he breathed, then stepped aside. "Get in here, both of you, before you freeze solid." They stumbled across the threshold, trailing snow and ice. Silas slammed the door against the wind and quickly grabbed the heavy wool blanket from his bed. His hands, usually so sure with trap and knife, felt clumsy as he wrapped it around their shivering shoulders. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the chair nearest the fire. "Both of you." They huddled together in the oversized chair, the blanket engulfing them like a wool cave. The firelight played across their faces, highlighting cheekbones sharp with cold and exhaustion. Their eyes, though, stayed fixed on him, watching, measuring, hoping. Silas grabbed his tin cup, filled it with water from the kettle he kept warm by the fire, and added a spoonful of honey he'd been saving for special occasions. He didn't know much about children, but he reckoned sweet warm water might help. "Drink this," he said, holding out the cup. "Slow now. Don't want to shock your insides." They took turns sipping, their small hands wrapped around the tin for warmth. As some color returned to their faces, Silas pulled up his stool, studying them with growing concern. Their clothes, though soaked, were finely made, not the sort you'd find in a mountain town. Their shoes were city shoes, now ruined by snow and ice. What in heaven's name were two young children doing out here, alone on such a night? "You got names?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite its disuse. The girl spoke first, her voice steadier now. "I'm Sarah." "Thomas," the boy added, still watching Silas carefully. "I'm Silas Boone," he offered, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Where are your folks?" The siblings exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Sarah's lower lip trembled, and Thomas pulled her closer. "They're gone," Thomas said finally. "Been gone 3 months now. Fever took them both." Silas felt something twist in his chest. "You been alone all that time?" Sarah shook her head. "Mrs. Wilkins at the orphanage took us in, but they were going to separate us." Her voice broke on the last word. "Send us to different families," Thomas explained, his young face hard with determination. "We heard them talking. Sarah to some folks in Virginia, me to a farm in Kentucky." "So you ran," Silas said. It wasn't a question. They nodded, and Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around them. "We can't be split up," she whispered. "We're all we got left." Silas understood then. The city clothes, their desperate flight, the impossible journey that had somehow led them to his door. These children had chosen the unknown terrors of the wilderness over the certainty of being torn apart. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Silas should send them back, he knew, should ride out tomorrow and return them to the orphanage. It was the proper thing, the legal thing. But the thought of these two being separated, shipped off to different lives, made that long dormant something in his chest ache fiercely. "Please, mister," Sarah said suddenly, her voice small but clear. Her eyes, bright with tears and firelight, met his directly. "Be our daddy." Beside her, Thomas nodded, his face a mixture of fear and hope. "We can work hard. We can learn whatever you need to teach us." "We won't be no trouble," Sarah added quickly. Silas felt the world shift beneath him. He looked at their faces, so young and yet marked by loss, and saw echoes of his own solitude. He thought of Morning Flower, of the family they might have had, of all the years he'd spent pushing away the world's hurt by hiding in these mountains. The words stuck in his throat. He'd been alone so long, had built his walls so high. What did he know about being a father? He was too old, too broken, too set in his ways. And yet, "You don't know what you're asking," he said roughly. "I ain't fit to be nobody's daddy. I'm just an old mountain man. Ain't got no proper schooling, no fancy ways. Been alone up here longer than you two been alive." "We don't need fancy," Thomas said. "Just need somebody to care if we freeze or not." The simple truth of it hit Silas like a physical blow. Wasn't that what he'd been muttering to himself just before they knocked? That no one would care if he froze? Sarah reached out one small hand and touched his rough sleeve. "You already cared enough to let us in," she said softly. Silas stared at her hand on his arm, then at their faces in the firelight. The sleet continued its assault on the roof, but somehow the cabin didn't feel as empty as it had before. The knife he'd been sharpening lay forgotten on the table, its keen edge catching the flame's reflection. "A good knife speaks true," Morning Flower had said. Maybe, just maybe, these children were speaking true as well. He cleared his throat, buying time to steady his voice. "You two need dry clothes and proper food before we talk about anything else. Got some old shirts might serve as nightgowns for now. Then we'll see about some stew." He paused, something occurring to him. You ain't allergic to rabbit, are you? They shook their heads, hope beginning to bloom on their faces. Well then, Silas said, rising to fetch the shirts. Reckon we'll start with that. The wind howled outside, but for the first time in years, Silas Boone wasn't listening to the emptiness. Instead, he found himself hearing the quiet breathing of two children who had chosen him, who had seen something in his hermit's heart that he'd forgotten was there. He wasn't sure if this was God's blessing or curse, but as he watched them huddle closer in his chair, their eyes following his movements with trust he hadn't earned, he felt something long frozen begin to thaw. The children's wet clothes steamed gently by the fire as Silas paced the worn floorboards of his cabin. The strange silence pressed in on him, not the familiar emptiness he knew, but something different, filled with soft breathing and the rustle of blankets. Can't keep them, he muttered under his breath, running a calloused hand through his graying hair. Got to take them back first light. Ain't right, them being here. But even as he said it, his eyes drifted to where they huddled together on his bedroll near the hearth. The boy, no, Josiah, he corrected himself, had finally stopped shivering. His sister Dinah kept one arm protectively around him, her dark eyes following Silas's movements. Sir? Dinah's voice was barely above a whisper. We ain't got nowhere else to go. Silas stopped his pacing, studying them in the firelight. They looked so small against his rough woolen blanket, yet there was something in their faces that spoke of having seen too much. What happened to your folks? He asked, his voice gruffer than he meant it to be. Dinah's chin trembled, but she squared her shoulders. Mama and Papa were freedmen. They had papers and everything. Papa worked at the livery stable in town, and Mama took in washing. Her voice caught. Then the fever came. 3 weeks ago, Josiah added softly, speaking for the first time since they'd gotten warm. Papa went first, then Mama. Silas felt something in his chest constrict. 3 weeks. These little ones had been alone for 3 weeks. Been living in old Mr. Jenkins's storage shed, Dinah continued. But it got so cold, and we ran out of the food Mama left. She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Saw your chimney smoke, Josiah said, through the trees. Dinah said maybe God was showing us where to go. Silas turned away, pretending to check the fire. These children had no business trusting him, no business looking at him like he was some kind of answer to prayer. He was just an old mountain man who'd turned his back on the world years ago. Still, he found himself reaching for the cornbread he'd baked that morning. Breaking it into pieces, he handed it to them, watching as they tried not to snatch it too eagerly. Eat slow now, he cautioned. Don't want it coming back up. They nodded, taking careful bites. Dinah broke her piece in half, making sure Josiah got the bigger portion. The gesture reminded Silas so much of his own sister from long ago that he had to look away. Get some sleep, he said gruffly. We'll sort things out come morning. But sleep wouldn't come to Silas. As the children's breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of exhaustion, he kept moving between the window and the fire. The storm continued its assault outside, and for the first time in years he found himself talking to God. What am I supposed to do with them? He whispered, staring into the flames. I ain't fit to care for children, you know that, after what happened with Morning Flower. He swallowed hard. Ain't been nothing but a hermit these past 15 years. These young ones need more than an old mountain man can give. The fire crackled, offering no answers. But as he watched the twins sleep, something shifted in his heart. They looked peaceful now, trust written across their young faces. Trust he hadn't earned and wasn't sure he deserved. Lord, he whispered again, his voice rough with emotion. If this is your doing, you're going to have to help me. I don't know the first thing about being anybody's daddy. The night stretched on, measured by the slow burning of logs and the steady fall of sleet against the windows. Silas dozed fitfully in his chair, his mind full of memories he'd tried to forget. Morning Flower's smile, the sound of children's laughter, the weight of loss. When dawn finally began to paint the eastern sky in pale grays, Silas stirred, his joints protesting the night spent in the chair. He'd take the children to town as soon as it was proper light, he decided. Someone there would know what to do with them. But as he opened his eyes fully, he found himself staring at a sight that stopped his thoughts cold. Dinah stood at his small cook stove, carefully stirring a pot of morning mush with the same concentration he'd seen her mother's kind use when cooking. Her hair had been neatly plaited, though some rebellious strands curled around her face in the steam. Josiah knelt by the hearth, methodically feeding small pieces of kindling into the fire, just as Silas himself did each morning. The boy had a natural feel for it, choosing the driest pieces first, building the flame slowly. But what truly caught in Silas's throat was the sight of his usually cluttered cabin. His few possessions had been straightened, his blankets folded with careful precision, his boots lined up neatly by the door. Even his hunting knife had been placed carefully on its proper shelf. "Good morning, Mr. Silas," Dinah said, turning from the stove with a shy smile. "We wanted to help, seeing as you took us in and all." "We said our prayers for you," she added softly, ducking her head. "Asked God to bless you special, for being kind to us in the storm." A sound escaped Silas then, something between a cough and a laugh, startling him with its unfamiliarity. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed, yet here it was, bubbling up from some long-buried place in his soul. "Well now," he managed, his voice rough with more than just sleep. "Reckon that's the first time anybody's prayed for old Silas in a mighty long while." Josiah looked up from the fire, his dark eyes serious. "Mama always said prayers and helping are how you show love. And since you helped us—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Silas felt something crack inside him, not breaking exactly, but opening like spring ice on the river. These children, with their simple faith and willing hands, had done more than just tidy his cabin. They'd somehow begun to tidy the cluttered, dusty corners of his heart. He found himself moving to the stove, checking the mush that Dinah stirred so carefully. "Smells good," he said gruffly. "Your mama teach you to cook?" Dinah's face lit up. "Yes, sir. She showed me how to make do with whatever we had. Said a good meal can make people feel loved, even when times are hard." "That's so?" Silas found himself pulling down 3 bowls instead of his usual one. "Well, reckon we ought to eat then before it gets cold." The words about taking them to town stuck in his throat. Instead, he watched as they bowed their heads over their bowls, whispering grace with the easy faith of children who hadn't yet learned to doubt God's care. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending shafts of light through his window to dance on the swept floor. Silas saw his cabin through new eyes, not as the hermit's cave it had become, but as the home it might be. The thought should have terrified him, but somehow watching Dinah carefully portion out the mush and Josiah tend the fire with such concentration, he felt something like hope stir in his chest. Perhaps God hadn't cursed him with these children after all. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was grace wrapped in the form of 2 small strangers who saw in him something he'd forgotten existed. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge when Silas led his old mule, Betsy, from the lean-to shelter behind his cabin. Frost crunched under his boots as he secured the saddle, checking the cinch twice out of habit. Behind him, the twins watched from the doorway, their eyes wide with uncertainty. "Best get moving before the day gets away from us," Silas said, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Town's a fair piece down the mountain." Dinah stepped forward first, her small hand finding his weathered one as they started down the narrow trail. Josiah followed close behind, his eyes darting to every movement in the underbrush. The path wound between towering pines, their branches still heavy with yesterday's snow. "Careful now," Silas warned as they negotiated a particularly steep section. "Trail gets tricky here." He lifted Dinah over a fallen log, then helped Josiah across. The boy's attention, however, was fixed on something in the mud. "What made those marks, Mr. Silas?" Josiah pointed to a set of prints pressed into the soft earth. Silas found himself kneeling beside the boy before he could think better of it. "There's a coyote track. See how the print's longer than it is wide, and those claw marks at the top?" His finger traced the outline in the mud. "Different from a dog's print. Coyotes got longer toes." Josiah nodded solemnly, studying the track with intense concentration. A few yards further down the trail, he spotted another set of impressions. "How about these big ones?" "Elk," Silas explained, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. "Passed through here early this morning, probably heading down to the meadow." He pointed out the distinctive heart-shaped prints, showing how the larger ones overlapped with smaller tracks. "That's the mother and calf together." Dinah squeezed his hand tighter as they continued their descent. "You know everything about the mountain, don't you, Mr. Silas?" "Not everything," he muttered, but found himself pointing out more signs as they walked. Rabbit tracks crossing the path, the marks where a turkey had scratched for food, the torn bark where a bear had clawed a tree last spring. The children absorbed every word, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Silas caught himself actually enjoying their curiosity, their wonder at things he'd long since taken for granted. It wasn't until they rounded the final bend, bringing the town into view, that reality settled back over him like a heavy cloak. The main street stretched before them, muddy from melted snow and rutted with wagon tracks. A few horses stood hitched outside the general store, steam rising from their flanks in the late morning sun. As Silas led the children and Betsy down the street, heads turned. Conversations stopped. Eyes narrowed. He felt Dinah press closer to his side, her fingers tightening around his. Josiah moved to walk on his other side, as if seeking shelter from the stairs. Silas straightened his spine, trying to ignore the whispers that followed their progress. The white-clappered church sat at the far end of the street, its steeple reaching skyward like an accusing finger. Reverend Cobb stood on the steps, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he recognized the approaching trio. "Silas Boone," the preacher said, descending to meet them. "It's been, 3 years since you've come to town?" His kind eyes fell on the children. "And who might these young ones be?" "Found them at my door last night," Silas explained gruffly. "Lost their folks to fever a few weeks back. Figured you'd know what to do with them." The Reverend's face grew grave. "Perhaps we should step inside." The church was empty, sunlight streaming through its simple windows to pool on worn wooden pews. Their footsteps echoed in the quiet space as Reverend Cobb led them to his small office at the back. "Children," he said gently, "would you mind waiting just outside while I speak with Mr. Boone?" Dinah looked up at Silas, reluctant to let go of his hand. He gave her fingers a quick squeeze before she and Josiah stepped into the hall, closing the door behind them. "Silas," Reverend Cobb began, sinking into his chair with a weary sigh, "I wish I had better news. But colored orphans, they don't last long in this town. You know how things are." "Meaning what exactly?" Silas's voice had an edge to it. "The county orphan agent was here just yesterday. Any unclaimed colored children are to be put on the next train east within the week." The Reverend ran a hand over his face. "They're setting up homes back there, they say. Places that'll take such children in." "They'll split them up," Silas said, his words coming out like stones. "Send them to different places, different strangers." "Most likely, yes." Reverend Cobb wouldn't meet his eyes. "The law is the law, Silas. What else can we do?" Through the door, Silas could hear Dinah's voice, soft but clear, singing what sounded like a hymn. Josiah's higher pitch joined in, the words indistinct, but the harmony perfect. Something twisted in his chest, sharp as a knife. "They're just babies," he said roughly. "Lost everything already, now you're telling me they'll lose each other too?" "Unless someone claims them officially." The Reverend let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Before Silas could respond, the door opened and several townspeople pushed their way in. He recognized Seth Jenkins, the store owner, and Martha Whitaker, who ran the boarding house. Their faces were set with familiar disapproval. "Reverend," Jenkins said, pointedly ignoring Silas, "we heard the mountain man brought some unexpected visitors to town." "Now, Seth," Reverend Cobb began, but Martha cut him off. "It ain't proper," she declared, her thin lips pressed together. "Him living up there alone with those children? People will talk." Outside the office, Silas could see more faces gathering, peering through the church windows. The twins had pressed themselves against the wall, Dinah's arms around her brother's shoulders as the adults crowded the narrow hallway. "Ain't none of your business," Silas growled, feeling the old anger rise in his throat. The same anger that had driven him up the mountain all those years ago, after Morning Flower. "It's everybody's business," Jenkins shot back. "This is a respectable town. We can't have—" "Can't have what?" Silas stepped forward, his voice dangerous and low. "Can't have two innocent children finding shelter from a storm? Can't have someone showing a scrap of Christian charity?" The muttering from the gathered townsfolk grew louder. Silas felt the familiar weight of their judgment, their suspicion, their fear of anything different from themselves. But this time, instead of retreating, he held his ground. Dinah and Josiah slipped back into the office, pressing close to his legs. He felt Dinah's small hand find his again, felt Josiah's fingers grip his coat. The trust in their touch was like a brand against his conscience. "The orphan train comes through on Saturday," Jenkins announced as if delivering a verdict. "Agent Williams will see they're properly placed with their own kind." "Their own kind?" Silas's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Their kind is children, just children who need a home." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words and long-held prejudices. Reverend Cobb stood slowly, his eyes moving from the twins to Silas and back again. "Perhaps," the preacher said carefully, "we should all take some time to pray about what's best for these little ones." But Silas could read the writing on the wall as clearly as if it had been carved there. In 4 days, unless something changed, these children who had survived fever, cold, and hunger would face their greatest loss yet, each other. He looked down at their upturned faces, saw the fear and hope warring in their eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been frozen for 15 years began to thaw, painful as spring ice breaking up on the river. The townsfolk continued to mutter, their disapproving gazes burning into his back. But for the first time in years, Silas found he cared less about their judgment than about the small hands clutching his coat, the silent plea in those young eyes that had already seen too much sorrow. The law was the law, they said. But Silas Boone had learned long ago that sometimes the law of the heart spoke louder than any written in books. The sunlight slanted long across the muddy street as Silas strode away from the church, his boots striking the wooden sidewalk with sharp, angry steps. His mind churned with the townsfolk's words, their narrowed eyes, their judgment hanging thick as storm clouds. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the soft footfalls behind him until a small voice called out, "Mr. Silas, wait for us." He turned to find Dinah and Josiah hurrying after him, their faces hopeful despite everything that had just happened. Something caught in his throat at the sight of them, determined and trusting even now. "You two head back to the church," he said gruffly. "Reverend'll sort things." But Dinah shook her head, her chin set stubbornly. "We want to stay with you." Before Silas could argue, jeering voices cut through the air. A group of children had gathered near the general store, pointing and snickering. "Look at them following that old mountain man like lost puppies. Bet they sleep in his barn with the animals. My pa says colored folk ain't supposed to live with white folks." Josiah pressed against Silas's leg, trying to make himself smaller. Silas felt the boy trembling and laid a rough hand on his shoulder. Beside them, Dinah stood straight-backed, but Silas saw her lip quiver as she blinked back tears. The taunts grew louder, bolder. Anger rose in Silas's chest like a gathering storm. He'd weathered worse in his life, but seeing these children targeted made something snap inside him. He turned toward the group, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "That's enough!" His voice carried down the street like thunder. The young tormentors fell silent, some backing away. But their retreat was cut short by heavy footsteps approaching from behind. "Everything all right here, Boone?" Marshal Clayton Reeves stood there, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, sharp eyes taking in the scene. His badge caught the late afternoon sun as he shifted his weight, studying Silas and the twins with calculated interest. "Just heading home," Silas muttered, turning away. "Hold up there." The marshal's voice stopped him. "Word's getting around about these two showing up at your place." He gestured at the children. "You planning to keep 'em?" Silas felt Dinah's hand slip into his, felt Josiah press closer to his side. The marshal's eyes narrowed at the gesture. "Folks don't take kindly to that sort of arrangement," Reeves continued, his tone careful but pointed. "Might be best for everyone if you let the proper authorities handle things." Proper authorities, Silas repeated, the words bitter as creek water in winter. Like them, orphan trained people who'd split them apart? The marshal's face hardened. Law's the law, Boone. Don't go making trouble for yourself. He paused, letting the warning sink in. Towns got certain ways. Best remember that. The rest of the walk to where Silas had left his mule was silent, but he could feel eyes following them from every window, every doorway. The twins stayed close, their earlier chatter about animal tracks forgotten. Even Betsy seemed to sense the tension, her ears flicking nervously as Silas helped the children up onto her back. The journey back up the mountain passed in heavy quiet. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the snow-patched ground in shades of orange and purple. Inside, Silas built up the fire while Dinah and Josiah huddled together on his bedroll, sharing his old wool blanket. Night settled over the mountain like a heavy quilt. Silas sat in his chair, watching the flames dance and listening to the twins' steady breathing as they drifted off to sleep. Their faces looked so peaceful, so trusting. Dinah's hand still clutched her brother's even in sleep. The scene brought back memories he'd tried hard to bury. Morning Flower's dark eyes, bright with love and promise, the way she'd laugh at his clumsy attempts to learn her language, the plans they'd made, dreams of a life together. But the town had seen to that. Their whispers, their stares, their friendly warnings about mixed marriages had worn her down until she'd left, taking his heart with her. Now here he was again, feeling the same prejudice pressing in from all sides. Only this time, it wasn't just his happiness at stake. These children needed more than a temporary shelter. They needed a home, a family, someone to stand between them and a world too ready to tear them apart. Dinah stirred in her sleep, her face scrunching slightly. "Pa," she mumbled, the words soft as a prayer in the firelit quiet. Something broke open in Silas's chest, something that had been frozen for 15 long years. He remembered Morning Flower's last words to him. Some fights are worth losing everything for. Back then, he hadn't been strong enough to fight. He'd let the town's hatred win, retreated to his mountain, built walls around his heart. But watching these children sleep, hearing that simple word, Pa, he knew he couldn't run this time. The decision settled into his bones like spring thaw into winter ground. If the town thought him unfit to raise these children, they'd learn different. They'd see a man who could provide, protect, and care for two souls who needed him. As the fire burned low, Silas's eyes fell on his old razor, sitting unused on the shelf. Come morning, he'd put it to work. His best shirt, the one he'd bought for his wedding day, still hung in the back of his trunk, probably dusty but serviceable. He'd make himself presentable, show the town he wasn't just some wild mountain man. The wind whispered outside, carrying the lonely song of a nightbird. But inside the cabin, something had changed. The empty spaces that had echoed with silence for so long now held the soft breathing of children. His children, if he had anything to say about it. Silas leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the sleeping twins. Morning would bring its challenges, but his path was clear now. The town would have to accept them, or he'd find somewhere that would. He wouldn't let these children face the orphan train, wouldn't let them be separated, sent to face the world alone. Let the marshal make his threats. Let the townsfolk whisper and stare. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Looking at Dinah and Josiah, peaceful under his blanket, Silas knew he'd finally found his reason to stand his ground. The night grew deeper, and still Silas kept his vigil, planning his next moves. When dawn broke, he'd begin the work of becoming what these children needed, not just a shelter from the storm, but a father they could depend on, prejudice and law be damned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Silas led the twins toward the courthouse. He'd spent an hour getting ready, trimming his wild beard, and wrestling with the stiff collar of his best shirt. The garment felt like a noose around his neck, but he reckoned looking respectable mattered today. Dinah walked on his right, her small hand tucked in his while Josiah kept pace on his left. Both children wore the cleanest clothes they owned, though the fabric was worn thin in places. Silas had done his best to make them presentable, even managing to tame Dinah's unruly curls with careful combing. The courthouse loomed ahead, its weathered boards and tall windows imposing against the morning sky. Already, townsfolk gathered on the steps and along the street, their whispers following the unlikely trio like autumn leaves in the wind. Silas kept his chin high, though his stomach churned with each step. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Marshal Reeves stood near the door, arms crossed, watching Silas with narrowed eyes. Judge Hargrave sat behind his heavy oak desk, his silver hair catching the light from the tall windows. His weathered face showed no emotion as he adjusted his spectacles and picked up the papers before him. The room fell silent, waiting. "Mr. Boone," the judge began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is unusual. You're petitioning for guardianship of these children?" He gestured toward Dinah and Josiah, who sat straight-backed in chairs too big for them. "Yes, Your Honor." Silas's voice came out rough but clear. The judge's frown deepened as he shuffled through the papers. "In all my years on this bench, I've never known you to raise so much as a chicken, Boone. What makes you think you can care for two growing children?" Before Silas could answer, a voice boomed from the back of the room. "He just wants heirs to stake more land." Frank Wesley, one of the biggest ranchers in the county, stood up, his face red with indignation. That old mountain man's been squatting on prime grazing land for years. Now he wants to grab more by claiming orphans. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Silas felt Dinah's hand tighten in his, felt Josiah press closer to his side. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before turning to face the crowd. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I got no heirs because God never saw fit to give me any." The words caught in his throat, memories of Morning Flower flickering through his mind. "These children, they chose me, came to my door in the storm when nobody else would take them in." He gestured to the twins. "They need someone to care for them, teach them. I may not be what folks here consider proper, but I can give them a home. Keep them safe. Keep them together." The room buzzed with whispers again, but a new voice cut through the noise. Reverend Cobb rose from his seat, a folded paper in his hand. "Your Honor, if I may." The preacher moved forward, his steps measured. "I have here a letter from a Union captain regarding these children's father." He handed the document to the judge. "James Carter served honorably in the colored infantry. He died defending this nation's principles of liberty and justice for all." The judge studied the letter, his expression thoughtful. "And their mother?" "Sarah Carter was a God-fearing woman," Reverend Cobb continued. "She raised these children with love and taught them their letters before fever took her. They deserve the chance to honor their parents' memory by growing up in a stable home." Judge Hargrave removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. The room held its breath, waiting. Finally, he looked up, his gaze moving from Silas to the children and back again. "Mr. Boone, raising children is no small task. They need education, guidance, proper Christian upbringing." He paused, considering. "However, your willingness to step forward, despite certain obstacles, speaks to your character." The judge straightened in his chair. "I'm granting you temporary guardianship until spring. We'll review the situation then, see how things progress." He fixed Silas with a stern look. "Don't make me regret this decision." Relief flooded through Silas's chest. He felt Dinah and Josiah's arms wrap around his waist, their joy radiating like sunshine. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down." As they left the courthouse, Silas noticed Miss Thompson, the schoolmistress, watching them from across the street. He approached her, touching his hat politely. "Ma'am, I was hoping to enroll the children in your school." Miss Thompson's face pinched tight as a dried apple. "I'm sorry, Mr. Boone, but that won't be possible. My school is at capacity." She turned away quickly, her skirts swishing in the dust. Marshal Reeves stepped forward then, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "Congratulations on your victory, Boone." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just remember, I'll be keeping a close watch. Any hint of impropriety, any reason to question your fitness as a guardian. He let the threat hang in the air. Silas met his gaze steadily. Won't be necessary, Marshal. These children will want for nothing under my care. The twins stood prouder now, their faces beaming as they walked beside him. Dinah swung his hand, humming a hymn her mother had taught her. Josiah pointed excitedly at a hawk circling overhead, asking if they could learn more about birds when they got home. Pa, Dinah said, testing the word openly now, can we stop at the general store? I know how to make biscuits like Mama showed me, if we get some flour. Silas felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the word pa. He nodded, fishing in his pocket for the coins he'd saved. Reckon we could do that. Maybe get some molasses, too. They walked down the street together, ignoring the stares and whispers. Silas knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The town's prejudice still hung over them like storm clouds. But for now, the twins' happiness lit up the morning like sunrise over the mountains, and that was enough. Back at the general store, Dinah carefully selected their supplies while Josiah helped carry the packages. They might not have much, Silas thought, but they had each other. Sometimes that was all the family you needed. The three of them headed home, their shadows stretching long behind them on the trail. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but today they were family, temporary guardianship or not. And Silas would make sure it stayed that way, no matter what spring might bring. The mountain air turned crisp as autumn settled in, painting the aspens gold against the evergreens. Life at Silas's cabin fell into comfortable patterns, like a stream finding its course through rocky ground. Each day brought new lessons, both for the children and for Silas himself. Morning light found them gathered around the worn table, steam rising from tin cups of chicory coffee for Silas and warm milk for the twins. Silas watched as Dinah carefully measured cornmeal into a wooden bowl, her tongue poking out in concentration. Like this, Pa? She asked, stirring in buttermilk with determined strokes. Mama always said the secret was in the mixing. Reckon you're doing fine. Silas nodded, though truth be told, he knew more about skinning rabbits than baking bread. He'd been living on basic fare for so long, the sight of Dinah trying to recreate her mother's recipes squeezed something tight in his chest. The first batch of cornbread came out black as coal on the bottom, filling the cabin with smoke. Dinah's lower lip trembled as she stared at the ruined bread. Now don't fret, Silas said, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. Took me near a month to learn to make coffee without burning it. We'll try again tomorrow. Josiah, who had been quiet until then, piped up from his spot by the window. Can we check the snares now, Pa? You promised to show us how to set them proper. Silas nodded, grateful for the chance to teach something he knew well. They headed out into the cool morning, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. He showed them how to choose the right spots along rabbit trails, how to set the wire just so. Gentle with those hands, he instructed, watching Josiah's fingers work the snare. Too tight, and it'll spook them. Too loose, and they'll slip right through. The boy's face scrunched in concentration as he adjusted the wire. Dinah watched intently, asking questions about which plants attracted rabbits and why they chose certain paths. Later that afternoon, Silas stood on the cabin roof, showing them how to replace worn shingles before winter set in. The twins handed up tools and materials, eager to help. Mind those nails, he called down, watching them sort through the tin box. Don't want any underfoot come snowfall. Dinah organized the shingles by size while Josiah held the hammer when Silas climbed down. Their small hands were becoming capable, learning the rhythm of mountain life. Each day they grew more sure of themselves, more at home in the cabin's routines. As evening drew in, they gathered around the fireplace. The old Bible that had gathered dust on Silas's shelf now sat open on his lap, its pages worn but clean. He'd avoided it for years, the words inside reminding him too much of what he'd lost, of the rejection that drove him to the mountains. Read to us, Pa? Dinah asked, settling beside him with her quilt. The part about families again? Silas's fingers trembled slightly as he turned to Psalm 68. The lamplight flickered across the pages, making the words dance. His voice came out rough at first, unused to reading aloud. God setteth the solitary in families, he read, the words catching in his throat. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains. A tear slipped down his weathered cheek, surprising him. Dinah reached up and wiped it away with her small hand, just as she did when Josiah scraped his knee. "Don't be sad, Pa," she whispered. "We're family now." Silas pulled them both close, their warmth reminding him that sometimes God's greatest gifts came wrapped in storm clouds and desperate knocks on cabin doors. But while life in the cabin grew sweeter, trouble brewed in town like a thunderhead over the mountains. Frank Wesley, the rancher who had opposed Silas in court, wasn't content to let matters lie. His words poisoned the well of public opinion, spreading through the town like creek water in spring thaw. "Ain't natural," Wesley told anyone who would listen, holding court at the general store. "That hermit's got something planned, mark my words. Probably aiming to claim more territory once he's got those children registered as his." The whispers grew louder, carried on the autumn wind. Some folks claimed Silas was too rough to raise children properly. Others suggested darker motives, their words bitter with prejudice and fear. One Sunday morning, after the twins had run ahead to play with the few children who would speak to them, Reverend Cobb pulled Silas aside. The preacher's face was drawn with worry, his usual gentle manner tense. "Brother Silas," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I fear there's trouble brewing. Marshal Reeves has been asking questions, gathering statements from certain parties about your fitness as a guardian." Silas's hand tightened on his hat brim, the worn felt crumpling in his grip. The thought of losing the twins sent ice through his veins, colder than any mountain winter. "They ain't taking my children," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not while I draw breath." Reverend Cobb nodded, understanding in his tired eyes. "I'll do what I can to help, brother, but be careful. The marshal's looking for any excuse, any small slip that might give him cause to intervene." "Much obliged for the warning," Silas replied, watching Dinah and Josiah playing by the church steps. Their laughter carried on the breeze, precious as spring water in drought. That evening, after the twins were asleep in their new bed, built from pine boards Silas had planed himself, he sat long by the fire, thinking. The flames painted shadows on the cabin walls, reminding him of all the lonely nights before the children came. He thought of Morning Flower, how the town's prejudice had driven her away, taking their dreams of family with her. He'd let that happen once, let others dictate his happiness. Looking at the sleeping twins, their faces peaceful in the firelight, he made a silent vow. "Lord," he whispered, his rough hands clasped tight, "you sent these children to my door. Don't reckon I deserve such a blessing, but I aim to protect what you've given me, whatever comes." He added more wood to the fire, watching the sparks rise up the chimney like prayers. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the valley, but inside the cabin, warmth and family filled every corner. Silas settled into his chair, keeping watch through the night, a father's love burning fiercer than any flame. The next morning he began teaching the twins more intently, not just cabin skills, but reading and figures too. If the town wouldn't school them, he'd do it himself. Dinah proved quick with letters, while Josiah showed a gift for numbers. Every small victory, every new skill mastered, felt like building a wall against those who would tear them apart. "You're doing just fine," he told them after Dinah finally managed a perfect batch of cornbread. "We're gonna be all right." And for now, in their small cabin high above the town's whispers, they were more than all right. They were family, bound together by something stronger than blood or law, the love that God plants in hearts ready to receive it, even hearts long closed by hurt and solitude. Josiah looked up from his slate where he practiced his numbers. "Pa, can we check the snares again? I think I heard rabbits this morning." "After your lessons," Silas answered, watching Dinah sound out words in the Bible. "Then we'll see about getting something for supper." This was his family now, whatever the town might say, and he would fight to keep it, with everything he had. The morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight glinting off fresh snow that blanketed the cabin yard. Silas stood on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his calloused hands. His breath fogged in the crisp air as he watched the twins venture out into the pristine white expanse. Dinah and Josiah waded through knee-deep drifts, their laughter echoing across the silent mountainside. They had never seen such deep snow before, and their wonder brought a smile to Silas's weathered face. "Pa, come help us build a snowman," Dinah called, already rolling a ball of snow that grew larger with each push. Josiah worked on a smaller ball, his cheeks red with cold and excitement. "We can use your old hat for his head." Silas set his coffee mug on the porch rail and trudged through the snow to join them. "Reckon my spare hat might work," he said, watching them work. "But mind you don't get too wet out here." Together they shaped 3 massive snowballs, stacking them carefully. Silas lifted the children to help place the head, their small hands patting the snow smooth. Dinah found 2 dark stones for eyes, while Josiah broke a branch into arms. "He needs your hat, Pa," Dinah insisted, tugging at Silas's coat. With exaggerated reluctance that made the children giggle, Silas retrieved his old felt hat from its peg by the door. He placed it carefully on the snowman's head, stepping back to admire their work. "Looks right proper," he said, his heart warming at the pride on their faces, like he's ready for Sunday meeting. The children danced around their creation, singing a hymn about joy that their mother had taught them. Silas watched them, struck by how naturally happiness had returned to his life. For years, he had convinced himself that solitude was enough. Now, watching these 2 children play in his yard, he couldn't remember why he had ever believed that. That evening, Silas stirred a pot of rabbit stew, adding potatoes he had stored in the root cellar. The cabin filled with savory steam and warmth from the crackling fire. At the rough-hewn table, Dinah helped Josiah with his letters, their heads bent together over a slate. "Supper's ready," Silas announced, ladling the thick stew into tin bowls. They gathered around the table, and Dinah led them in grace, her clear voice strong and sure. After the meal, while Silas cleaned the bowls, Dinah started singing another hymn, one about God's love being like a mountain stream. Josiah joined in, his softer voice harmonizing with his sister's. The familiar tune stirred something in Silas's memory, his own mother singing as she worked, back before the war changed everything. Without meaning to, he found his deep voice joining theirs, rough but true. The children's eyes widened in delight, and they sang louder, teaching him verses he had forgotten. The cabin walls seemed to glow with more than firelight, filled with the simple joy of family singing together. But that joy proved fleeting. The next morning, Silas woke to the sound of harsh coughing. Josiah sat up in his bed, his small frame racked with spasms that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Silas crossed the cabin in 3 strides, placing a hand on the boy's forehead. His heart sank at the burning heat he felt there. Dinah hovered nearby, her face pinched with worry. "He was coughing some last night," she said quietly, "but not like this." Throughout the morning, Josiah's condition worsened. His breathing became labored, each inhale a frightening rattle. By afternoon, he could barely sit up, his face flushed with fever. Dinah knelt beside her brother's bed, her hands clasped tight. "Dear Lord," she prayed, her voice trembling but determined, "please help Josiah get better. Please don't take him away like Mama and Papa. Please ... Silas felt helpless watching her pray. He had treated fevers before with willow bark tea and cool compresses, but this was different. This was deeper, more dangerous. The boy's lips had taken on a bluish tinge that sent fear coursing through him. "Keep praying, girl," he said roughly, grabbing his heavy coat. "I'm fetching the doctor." Outside, the temperature had dropped further, and wind whipped snow into stinging clouds. Silas saddled his horse with shaking hands, his mind racing. The doctor lived on the edge of town, a good hour's ride in good weather. In this snow, who knew? He spurred his horse through the gathering dark, letting the animal pick its way down the treacherous mountain trail. Snow caked his beard and eyebrows, but he barely noticed the cold. His thoughts stayed fixed on Josiah's labored breathing, on Dinah's desperate prayers. The town was mostly dark when he arrived, only a few lamps still burning in windows. He thundered up to Dr. Langford's house, pounding on the door hard enough to rattle the frame. "Doc," he shouted, "Doc Langford, need you urgent." After what seemed an eternity, the door opened. Dr. Langford stood there in his nightshirt, holding a lamp. His expression sharpened when he saw Silas's face. "What's happened?" he asked, already turning to dress. "My boy," Silas said, the words catching in his throat. "Josiah, fever and coughing something fierce, can't hardly breathe." The doctor moved quickly, throwing on clothes and gathering his medical bag. Within minutes, they were both riding through the snowy night, pushing their horses as fast as they dared on the treacherous trail. When they reached the cabin, Dinah still knelt by her brother's bed, her prayers a constant whisper. Josiah's breathing had grown worse, each breath a desperate struggle that shook his whole body. Dr. Langford examined the boy thoroughly, his face growing grimmer by the minute. He listened to Josiah's chest with his stethoscope, felt his glands, checked his temperature. Finally, he straightened and pulled Silas aside. "It's lung fever," he said quietly. "Bad case. He needs special medicine, the new kind they keep at the railroad hospital in Fort Collins." "Fort Collins?" Silas's heart sank. "That's 2 days' ride." 2 days there, 2 days back," the doctor confirmed grimly. "And without that medicine..." He glanced at the sick child. "He won't last the week." Dinah had crept closer, her small face pale but determined. "Pa will get it," she said with complete conviction. "Won't you, Pa?" Silas looked at his son struggling for each breath, at his daughter's trusting face, at the doctor's grave expression. The railroad town was far, the winter dangerous. But looking at these children, his children, he knew there was no choice to make. "I'll leave at first light," he said. Dr. Langford nodded. "I'll write out what you need to ask for. Meanwhile, I'll stay here tonight, do what I can to ease his breathing." He hesitated, then added softly, "Ride fast, Silas. Time isn't on our side." Silas began gathering supplies, his movements quick and purposeful. He had traveled in winter before, knew what he would need, but he had never made such a journey with so much at stake. Dinah helped him pack, her small hands folding an extra shirt, tucking in dried meat and hard biscuits. She worked silently, but when he knelt to check his saddlebags, she threw her arms around his neck. "You'll make it in time," she whispered fiercely. "I know you will. God will help you just like he helped us find you." Silas hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair. From across the cabin came the sound of Josiah's labored breathing, each rattle a reminder of what hung in the balance. "You mind the doctor," he told her gruffly. "Help him care for your brother. I'll be back soon as I can." He stood watching his small family, the sick boy in the bed, the praying girl beside him, the grim-faced doctor preparing poultices. The scene burned itself into his memory, fueling his determination. Outside, the wind had died down, but snow still fell steadily. Silas checked his horse's tack one final time, making sure everything was secure. The night sky was beginning to lighten slightly in the east. First light wasn't far off. 2 days to Fort Collins, 2 days back, and his son's life hanging on every hour in between. Silas took one last look at the cabin, its windows glowing warm against the snow. Then he mounted his horse, turned its head toward the trail, and prepared for the longest ride of his life. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden clouds in shades of pearl and rose. Inside the warm cabin, Silas moved with quiet purpose, his weathered hands checking and double-checking the contents of his saddlebags. Every moment spent preparing was another precious breath struggled from Josiah's failing lungs. He packed carefully, 3 strips of jerky wrapped in cloth, 2 thick wool blankets rolled tight, and a small leather pouch that held the last of his coins. The weight of that pouch felt too light against his palm. Medicine wasn't cheap, especially not the new kind from back east, but he'd worry about that when he reached Fort Collins. Dr. Langford had stayed through the night, applying mustard plasters to Josiah's chest and spooning him sips of willow bark tea. The boy's breathing remained labored, each inhale a wet, rattling sound that tore at Silas's heart. "Keep him warm," Silas instructed Dinah, who hadn't left her brother's side since yesterday. "Mind what the doctor tells you." She nodded solemnly, her small face drawn with worry but determined. "I will, Pa. I promise." The word Pa still caught him sometimes, like a hook in his chest. He'd never thought to hear it spoken to him, not after all these years alone. Now it drove him forward, gave him strength he didn't know he had. Silas knelt beside her, his rough hands gentle as they smoothed back her hair. "Keep the fire burning till I return," he said softly. "Don't let it go out, you hear?" "I won't," she whispered. "Not even for a minute." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and the lye soap she used to wash her hair. Then he moved to Josiah's bedside, where the boy lay pale and sweating beneath a pile of quilts. "Hold on, son," he murmured, touching the boy's burning forehead. "Your pa's going to fetch what you need. Just hold on." Josiah's eyes flickered open, glazed with fever. His cracked lips moved, trying to form words, but only a weak cough emerged. Silas's throat tightened. Dr. Langford pulled him aside near the door. "Ride hard," he said in low tones. "But be careful. You're no good to them if you don't make it back." Silas nodded grimly. "I'll make it." Outside, the pre-dawn air bit through his heavy coat. His horse stamped restlessly in the fresh snow, breath streaming from its nostrils. Silas mounted up, settling into the saddle with the ease of long practice. He took one last look at the cabin, his home no longer empty but filled with precious life he had to protect. The trail down the mountain was treacherous in the dim light. Snow had drifted deep in places, hiding rocks and fallen branches. Silas let his horse pick its way carefully, though every delay made his shoulders tense with urgency. As the sun rose fully, painting the snow-covered landscape in blinding white, Silas found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a boy, praying out loud. "Lord," he said, his voice rough in the cold air, "I ain't been much for talking to you these past years. Reckon I figured you'd turned your back on me, same as everyone else." He ducked under a snow-laden branch. "But them children, they need your help now. That boy especially. Don't take him, Lord. Please. I'll do whatever you ask, just don't take him from us." The words felt strange on his tongue, but something in his chest loosened slightly as he spoke them, like a door, long rusted shut, creaking open just a crack. By midday, the weather turned against him. Fresh snow began falling, thick flakes that caught in his beard and eyelashes, making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. The wind picked up too, driving the snow sideways and cutting through his clothes like icy knives. His fingers, despite the thick gloves he wore, grew numb around the reins. He had to stop several times to tuck them under his armpits, waiting for feeling to return. Each stop made him curse under his breath, knowing every minute counted. The worst came at the river crossing. In summer, it was an easy ford, barely deep enough to wet a horse's knees. But now, in the grip of winter, the surface was a treacherous sheet of ice, partially hidden by snow. Silas dismounted to test it, stepping carefully. The ice seemed solid enough. He led his horse forward, one slow step at a time, the animal's hooves crunching through the crusty surface snow. They were halfway across when he heard it, a sharp crack that shot through the air like a rifle shot. Before he could react, the ice gave way beneath them. Black water, colder than death, swallowed him to the waist. The shock of it drove the breath from his lungs. His horse screamed, thrashing, as ice broke around them in jagged sheets. Purely by instinct, Silas maintained his grip on the reins, keeping his mount from panicking completely. But the cold, dear God, the cold. It stabbed into him like thousands of needles, immediately beginning to steal his strength. He fought against the current, trying to find purchase on the slippery ice. His boots scraped against nothing but water. The weight of his soaked clothes tried to drag him under. For one terrible moment, he felt his grip on the reins weakening. Maybe, a voice whispered in his mind, maybe this is how it's meant to end. Maybe the world was right all along. He wasn't meant for family, wasn't meant to be wanted or needed. Maybe the ice would just take him and that would be that. Then, clear as if she stood beside him, he heard Dinah's voice in his memory. "Be our daddy." The words hit him like a physical blow, driving back the creeping numbness. He could see her face, see Josiah's, see the trust in their eyes when they looked at him. They had chosen him. They wanted him. They needed him. With a roar that was half prayer and half curse, Silas heaved himself forward. His numb fingers found the edge of solid ice, and he dug in with all his strength. Somehow, through God's mercy or sheer stubborn will, he dragged himself out of the water. His horse followed, scrambling onto firm ice with his guidance. They made it to the far bank, but Silas could barely stand. His clothes were already freezing solid in the bitter wind. He stumbled to a grove of pines, knowing he needed shelter before the cold killed him. Under the lowest branches where the snow was thinner, he collapsed against a trunk. His whole body shook violently, teeth chattering so hard he thought they might break. The urge to close his eyes, to just rest for a moment, was almost overwhelming. "Be our daddy." The words came again, driving him back to his feet. Fumbling with frozen fingers, he stripped off his outer clothes and wrung them as best he could. From his saddlebag, thankfully somewhat protected from the water, he pulled one of the wool blankets and wrapped it around himself. "Got to keep moving," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Got to keep moving." His horse stood nearby, steam rising from its wet flanks. Silas knew they were both in danger of freezing if they didn't get warm soon. He had to make a choice: stop and build a fire, losing precious hours, or push on and risk death by cold. Once again he heard Dinah's voice, remembered Josiah's labored breathing. The choice was already made. Staggering back to his feet, Silas pulled himself into the saddle. His legs felt like blocks of ice, and his hands could barely grip the reins. But he turned his horse's head toward Fort Collins and urged it forward. "Just hold on, boy," he whispered, though whether he was talking to Josiah back home or himself, he wasn't sure. "Just hold on." They moved forward through the falling snow, man and horse pushing against the bitter wind. Silas kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, refusing to let his mind wander to warm cabins or soft beds. His world narrowed to simple things: the next step, the next breath, the memory of two small faces counting on him to return. The sun was falling toward the western peaks, but Silas pressed on. He had lost too much time at the river. The medicine waited in Fort Collins, and his son's life depended on him reaching it. Everything else, the cold, the exhaustion, the pain, would have to wait. He was no longer unwanted, no longer alone. He was a father now, chosen by two children who saw something in him worth believing in, and he would not let them down. Through the gathering dusk, Silas Boone rode on, leaving a trail of determination in the deepening snow. Frost-covered lanterns cast weak yellow light over Fort Collins' empty streets, as Silas urged his exhausted horse forward. His clothes had frozen solid, crackling with each movement. The wind had died down, but the bitter cold remained, seeping through to his bones. His fingers, numb and useless, could barely grip the reins. The town seemed deserted at this late hour, save for a few lights burning in upstairs windows. Silas's eyes fixed on the wooden sign hanging ahead: Williams Apothecary and Medicines. A dim glow showed through its frosted windows. Dismounting was agony. His legs nearly buckled as they took his weight, and he had to lean against his horse for several moments before he could stand straight. The few steps to the door felt like miles. The bell above the door jangled harshly as Silas burst in, bringing a blast of cold air with him. Behind the counter, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from his ledger, nose wrinkling at the sight of the frozen mountain man before him. "We're closing," the pharmacist said, already reaching for the lamp to dim it. "Need medicine," Silas croaked, his voice rough from hours of cold. "Lung fever. For my boy." The pharmacist, Williams, according to the sign on his desk, raised an eyebrow. "Your boy?" The skepticism in his voice was clear. "My son," Silas said firmly, though his teeth chattered. "Dr. Langford sent me. Said you'd have what he needs." "Ah, yes, the special compound for severe cases." Williams nodded slowly. "That would be $4. Silas fumbled with frozen fingers at his saddlebag, pulling out a small leather pouch. His hand shook so badly he could barely count the coins. $2.37, all he had left after months of sparse trading. "Please," he said, pushing the coins across the counter. "It's all I have, but I can trade." "No credit given," Williams cut him off, already turning away. "Especially not to mountain folk I don't know." Desperation clawed at Silas's chest. He thought of Josiah's labored breathing, of Dinah's tearful prayers. Without hesitation, he reached for his belt. The hunting knife clattered onto the counter, its bone handle worn smooth from years of use. "Worth at least $3, Silas said. "Best blade you'll find." Williams glanced at it but shook his head. Silas's hands went to his throat, unfastening the silver watch chain, his father's, the only thing he had left of him. This too. Sterling silver, worth more than the medicine twice over. The pharmacist's eyes showed interest now, but still he hesitated. "I don't know." "My boots," Silas said hoarsely, already bending to remove them. Handmade, barely worn. His stockinged feet met the cold floor as he placed the boots beside the other items. "Everything I have. Please." Something in his voice must have reached Williams. The man studied Silas's face for a long moment, then sighed. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back room, returning with a small brown bottle. "This is it. Mix 1 spoonful with water every 4 hours. If he lives through the first day, he'll likely recover." Silas reached for the bottle with trembling hands, cradling it like it was made of gold. "Thank you," he whispered. "God bless you." "Keep your boots," Williams said gruffly, pushing them back across the counter. "You'll freeze without them. The rest covers it." Silas nodded gratefully, tucking the precious medicine inside his shirt, close to his heart. The loss of his knife and watch meant nothing compared to the weight of that small bottle against his chest. The return journey was worse than the first. His horse, pushed beyond endurance on the ride to town, moved slower with each mile. The cold had settled deep in Silas's bones, making every movement a battle. But he pushed on, counting the hours, knowing each one that passed was another that Josiah struggled to breathe. He rode through the night, stopping only when his horse needed rest. The moon cast enough light to follow the trail, though the cold grew fiercer as midnight passed. Silas kept one hand pressed against the bottle under his shirt, as if he could protect it from the freezing temperatures with his own body heat. Near dawn on the second day, his horse stumbled. The loyal animal had given everything it had, but exhaustion finally won out. The horse's legs buckled, and it sank to its knees in the snow, sides heaving. "I'm sorry, old friend," Silas murmured, patting its neck as he dismounted. He removed the saddle and blanket, covering the horse as best he could. "Rest here. I'll send someone back for you when I can." Without hesitation, Silas turned toward home. His legs felt like lead, his feet numb inside his boots, but he forced himself forward. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and cold, but he thought of Josiah's face and found the strength to take another. "Josiah," he whispered, his breath freezing in the air. "Hold on, son. Pa's coming." The word Pa no longer felt strange on his tongue. Somewhere in these past weeks, it had become as natural as breathing. Those children had worked their way into his heart so gradually he hardly noticed, until they were as much a part of him as his own blood. The sun rose, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Silas barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, step after step, mile after mile. When he finally saw smoke rising from his cabin's chimney, he thought for a moment he was dreaming. But then the cabin itself came into view, snow piled high around its walls, and he knew he'd made it. The door burst open before he could reach it. Dinah flew out, her bare feet leaving small prints in the snow as she ran toward him. Her face was tear-streaked but full of joy. "Pa!" she cried. "Pa's home!" Silas's legs finally gave out. He sank to his knees in the snow as Dinah reached him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. With the last of his strength, he pulled the medicine bottle from inside his shirt. "Here," he rasped, pressing it into her hand. "For Josiah, 1 spoonful, with water, every 4 hours." Dinah's fingers closed around the bottle. "Dr. Langford is inside with him," she said. "He came to check again this morning. Said if we got the medicine today, Josiah would have a chance." Relief flooded through Silas, making him sway. He'd made it in time. The rest didn't matter. Not the cold, not his frozen limbs, not the possessions he'd traded. He'd brought the medicine home to his son. His son. The thought brought tears to his eyes, freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. These children had chosen him, had seen something in him worth loving when he'd forgotten it existed in himself. And now, holding Dinah while she cried against his shoulder, Silas knew he'd finally found what he'd been looking for all these years, a family of his own. "Let's get you inside, Pa," Dinah said, trying to help him up despite her small size. "You're frozen through." Silas managed to stand, leaning heavily on her shoulder. Together, they made their way toward the cabin's warm light, toward home, toward hope. The doctor's boots creaked on the wooden floor as he entered the cabin, medicine bag in hand. Dawn light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across Josiah's pale face where he lay bundled in Silas's bed. Dr. Langford worked quickly, measuring the precious medicine into a spoon with steady hands. "Open up, son," he murmured, and Josiah's cracked lips parted obediently. The boy swallowed with effort, his chest still rattling with each breath. Silas hovered nearby, his own exhaustion forgotten as he watched the doctor work. His clothes were still damp from the journey, but he barely noticed the chill. Dinah pressed against his side, her small fingers clutching his coat. "Every 4 hours without fail," Dr. Langford instructed, showing Silas how to measure the dose. "Keep him warm, but not too hot. Cool cloths for the fever. I'll return tomorrow to check his progress." The doctor paused at the door, studying Silas's haggard face. "You did well getting that medicine so quick. Not many would have made that ride in this weather." Silas nodded, unable to find words through his fatigue. After the doctor left, he sank into the chair beside Josiah's bed, where he would remain for the next 3 days. The hours blurred together in a haze of watchful waiting. Every 4 hours, like clockwork, Silas measured the medicine. Between doses, he bathed Josiah's forehead with cool cloths, watching for any sign of improvement. Dinah refused to leave their side, helping to change the cloths and whisper prayers over her brother. That first night she climbed into Silas's lap, her head heavy against his chest. "God won't take him," she murmured sleepily. "I asked him special." Her quiet faith brought tears to Silas's eyes as he wrapped his arms around her small frame. "Your prayers are stronger than mine, little one," he whispered into her hair. Through the long hours of the second night, Silas fought to stay awake. His body ached from the frozen river and the endless ride, but he couldn't bear to close his eyes. Instead, he watched Josiah's chest rise and fall, counting each breath like precious gold. The boy's breathing seemed a little easier now, though the rattle hadn't fully cleared. Dinah slept curled in a blanket on the floor nearby, having refused the offer of her own bed. Every few hours she would stir and lift her head, checking that both Silas and Josiah were still there. Each time Silas would reach down to squeeze her hand, reassuring her without words. The medicine worked its slow magic through the second day. The fever began to break, leaving Josiah's skin clammy but cooler to the touch. His breathing grew steadier, though still labored. Dr. Langford visited again, nodding with cautious approval at the boy's progress. "Keep doing what you're doing," he advised. "The worst may be past, but he's not out of danger yet." That evening, as Silas changed the cool cloth on Josiah's forehead, the boy stirred slightly. His eyelids fluttered, though they didn't open. Silas held his breath, hope rising in his chest, but Josiah slipped back into deeper sleep. Dinah had taken to singing softly while she helped tend her brother. Hymns their mother had taught them, she explained. Her sweet voice filled the cabin with "Amazing Grace" and "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Sometimes Silas found himself humming along, the old tunes coming back from his own childhood. Dawn broke on the third day, painting the cabin walls with pale golden light. Silas had just finished giving Josiah his medicine when the boy's eyes opened fully for the first time since the fever took hold. "Pa?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper, rough and uncertain. Something broke open in Silas's chest. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks as he gathered Josiah's thin frame into his arms. "I'm here, son," he choked out. "I'm right here." Dinah woke at the sound of their voices. She scrambled to her feet with a cry of joy, throwing herself onto the bed and wrapping her arms around both of them. Silas gathered her close with his free arm, holding both children against his heart. "I love you," he said, the words he'd held back for so long finally breaking free. "I love you, my son. My daughter." His voice cracked on the words, but he didn't care. These were his children, not by blood but by choice, by love, by the way God had brought them to his door that stormy night. Josiah's weak fingers clutched at Silas's shirt. "Knew you'd come back," he whispered. "Knew you wouldn't leave us." "Never," Silas promised fiercely. "Never gonna leave you. You're mine now, both of you. My family." They stayed like that for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms while morning light filled the cabin. Dinah began to sing again, softly. "This is my story. This is my song, praising my Savior all the day long." But their peace was short-lived. Later that afternoon, while Josiah slept and Dinah worked on a pot of soup, Reverend Cobb arrived with grave news. "Marshal Reeves is gathering support against you," he warned, speaking low near the door. "That rancher Edwards has been stirring up trouble. They're saying you endangered the children, leaving them alone while you went for medicine." Silas's jaw tightened. "What was I supposed to do, let my boy die?" "You and I know you did right," Cobb said, "but they're pushing for a hearing before the judge. They want the temporary guardianship revoked." The thought of losing the children now, after everything, made Silas's heart clench with fear. But when he looked at Josiah sleeping peacefully and Dinah humming as she stirred the soup pot, he felt steel enter his spine. "Let them try," he said quietly. "These are my children. God brought them to me, and I aim to keep them." Cobb studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The hearing's set for next week. Get your story straight. And Silas?" He paused at the door. "Might want to trim that beard and wear your Sunday best. Appearances matter to some folks." After the Reverend left, Silas stood at the window watching snow fall in the gathering dusk. The thought of facing the town's judgment again made his stomach knot, but he would do whatever it took. He'd fought through ice and exhaustion to save Josiah's life. He would fight just as hard to keep his family together. Dinah appeared at his elbow, offering a cup of coffee. "Don't worry, Pa," she said with wisdom beyond her years. "God didn't bring us this far to leave us now." Silas drew her close, pressing a kiss to her head. She was right, he realized. Whatever came next, they would face it together. He had something worth fighting for now, something bigger than his own solitary existence. He had love. He had family. He had hope. That evening, as he helped Josiah sit up to eat some soup, the boy's bright eyes and strengthening grip reminded him of why he'd made that desperate ride. Looking at his children, his son, his daughter, Silas knew he would do it again in a heartbeat. Let the marshal and the rancher come with their papers and their prejudices. They didn't understand the power of love to make a family from strangers, to heal old wounds, to bring light to dark places. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for the hearing. He would shave his beard, press his good shirt, and practice the words he would say to the judge. But tonight, he simply sat with his children, thanking God for the miracle of belonging to each other. The courthouse buzzed with tension as townsfolk filed in on that crisp winter morning. Silas stood near the front, his beard neatly trimmed and his good shirt pressed smooth, though his weathered hands couldn't stop fidgeting with his hat brim. Beside him, Dinah and Josiah sat close together on the wooden bench, their Sunday clothes freshly washed and pressed. Josiah's cheeks still held the pallor of his recent illness, but his eyes were bright as he looked up at Silas. "You ain't gonna let them take us, are you, Pa?" he whispered. Silas squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Not while I draw breath, son." Marshal Reeves strode in, his boots clicking against the floorboards. Behind him came a group of ranchers, including Edwards, their faces set with determination. The marshal carried a leather portfolio stuffed with papers, which he placed on the table with deliberate care. Judge Hargrave entered, his black robe sweeping as he took his seat. The room fell silent save for the creak of wooden benches as everyone rose, then settled again at his nod. "We're here today," the judge began, his voice filling the courthouse, "to review the temporary guardianship of Dinah and Josiah Carter, currently placed with Silas Boone. Marshal Reeves, you've brought charges of endangerment?" The marshal stood, straightening his vest. "Yes, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Boone demonstrated reckless neglect of these children during the recent winter storm." Silas's jaw tightened, but he kept his peace, remembering Reverend Cobb's advice to let the proceedings unfold. "Present your case," Judge Hargrave directed. Marshal Reeves lifted the first paper from his portfolio. "I have here signed affidavits from 3 prominent ranchers, including Mr. Edwards, testifying that Mr. Boone abandoned these children for 2 days during the worst storm of the season. He left them alone without supervision in a remote cabin." The marshal's voice grew harder as he continued. "Furthermore, the boy was desperately ill at the time. Mr. Boone's actions could have resulted in both children's deaths. They could have frozen or the cabin could have caught fire. There was no responsible adult within miles." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Silas felt Dinah's small hand slip into his, squeezing tight. "I also have documentation," the marshal continued, "showing that Mr. Boone has no experience raising children, no steady income beyond trapping, and no connection to proper society. These children deserve a stable home with a respectable family." Edwards stood up from his bench, adding his voice. "Those kids need Christian folk to raise them proper, not some mountain hermit who can't even show his face in town most days." Judge Hargrave raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Boone, do you wish to respond to these charges?" Silas rose slowly to his feet. His voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the hushed room. "Your Honor, I did leave the children that day. I left because my boy was dying." He turned slightly, meeting the eyes of those gathered. "Josiah had lung fever. Dr. Langford said without special medicine from the railroad town, he wouldn't last the week. So yes, I rode out in that storm. I crossed Timber Creek when the ice was breaking, lost my horse halfway back and walked the last 10 miles through snow up to my waist." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I gave away everything I owned, my knife, my father's watch, even my boots, to get that medicine. Nearly froze to death doing it. But I'd do it again right now if I had to, because that's what a father does for his child." Reverend Cobb stood up from his place near the back. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" At the judge's nod, the Reverend moved forward. "I've known Silas Boone for 15 years. Before these children came, he was indeed a hermit. Silent, solitary, cut off from God and man alike. But I've witnessed something remarkable these past months. I've seen a man transformed by love." The Reverend's voice grew passionate. "I've watched him teach these children to read from his Bible. I've seen him work extra hours mending fences to buy them warm clothes. When Josiah fell ill, this man who once couldn't bear to speak to his neighbors humbled himself before the whole town, begging for help to save his son." A few heads nodded in the crowd. Even some who had come to support the marshal looked thoughtful. "Your Honor," Reverend Cobb concluded, "I believe God brought these children to Silas's door that stormy night, and I believe he's used them to bring healing to a broken man's heart." Judge Hargrave leaned forward, studying the children. "Young lady," he addressed Dinah, "do you have anything to say about this matter?" Dinah stood, her small frame straight and proud, still holding Josiah's hand. "Yes, sir, I do." Her clear voice rang with conviction. "When Josiah got sick, Pa didn't abandon us. He saved my brother's life. A man who doesn't love his children just lets them die. But Pa gave away everything he had, even his boots, to get that medicine." She lifted her chin. "And when he came back, half frozen and bleeding from where he fell on the ice, the first thing he did was make sure we had the medicine. He didn't even take time to warm himself." Tears shone in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "If that ain't what a real daddy does, then I don't know what is." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Hargrave's stern face softened as he studied the three figures before him, the weathered mountain man and the two children who clung to him with such trust. The judge turned a hard gaze toward Marshal Reeves. "Marshal, are you a father yourself?" "No, Your Honor." "Then perhaps you don't understand that parenthood isn't measured by what we keep safe, but by what we're willing to risk for our children." The judge's voice grew steely. "Mr. Boone didn't endanger these children. He nearly died trying to save them. That's not neglect, Marshal, that's love." Judge Hargrave straightened in his chair. "I've heard enough. This case is dismissed. The charges of endangerment are without merit." He turned to address the whole room. "Let me be clear, fatherhood isn't measured in blood or money or standing in society. It's measured in sacrifice, in love, in the willing gift of one's own life for the sake of a child." His gavel cracked against the desk. "This hearing is concluded." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some townsfolk nodded in approval, while others frowned and whispered among themselves. Edwards stormed out, followed by several ranchers. But others came forward to shake Silas's hand, including some who had never spoken to him before. Dinah and Josiah threw their arms around Silas's waist. He knelt down, gathering them close, not caring who saw his tears. "Can we go home now, Pa?" Josiah asked softly. "Yes, son," Silas answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's go home." As they walked out into the winter sunshine, Reverend Cobb fell into step beside them. "The marshal won't give up easily," he warned quietly. "But you've won a victory today, Silas. You showed them what real family means." Silas nodded, feeling the weight of his children's hands in his. "Don't reckon it matters much what they think anymore, Reverend. Got everything I need right here." The small family made their way down the street, past the staring townsfolk, past the marshal's dark glare from the courthouse steps. Silas walked tall, a child on either side. He had faced down the town's judgment and won. More importantly, he had proven, to himself as much as to anyone, that love could make a family from strangers, that God could make a father from a hermit, that sacrifice could bridge any distance. The mountain air sparkled with fresh snow as life bloomed anew at Silas's cabin. Where silence had once reigned, laughter now echoed across the yard. Josiah, his strength returning day by day, chased his sister through knee-deep drifts, their breaths making clouds in the crisp morning light. "Can't catch me," Dinah called, ducking behind a snow-laden pine. "Just watch me." Josiah's voice rang strong and clear, so different from the weak whispers of his illness. Silas paused in his work on the roof, hammer mid-swing, to watch them play. His heart swelled at the sight of Josiah's pink cheeks and bright eyes. Just weeks ago, he'd feared he might lose the boy. Now, life flowed through him like spring water. "Pa," Dinah called up, "the bread needs checking." Silas carefully made his way down the ladder. Inside the cabin, warmth and the rich smell of baking bread wrapped around him like a blanket. Dinah hurried in behind him, shaking snow from her skirts. "Remember what I showed you?" Silas said, watching as she opened the oven door. "Tap the bottom. It should sound hollow." Dinah's face screwed up in concentration as she tested the loaf. "Like this?" "That's right." Silas nodded approvingly. "You're becoming quite the baker." Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Silas helped the twins brush their clothes and smooth their hair. His own best shirt felt stiff and formal, but he wanted them to look proper for church. They rode together on his mule, the twins securely settled before and behind him. As they approached the white-painted church, Silas felt the familiar tension creep into his shoulders. Townsfolk gathered on the steps, their whispers following his family like shadows. Inside, the murmurs grew louder as they took their usual back pew. Silas noticed Mrs. Porter, the schoolmistress, watching them with her usual pinched expression. The marshal sat near the front, his back rigid with disapproval. Reverend Cobb began the service, his voice filling the small space with familiar hymns and prayers. Then, unexpectedly, he paused. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "I feel led to call forward someone who has shown us all the true meaning of faith and family." His eyes found Silas. "Mr. Boone, would you join me?" Silas froze, his heart hammering. Before he could move, Dinah and Josiah were on their feet, each taking one of his weathered hands in their small ones. "Come on, Pa," Josiah whispered, tugging gently. The congregation seemed to hold its breath as the unlikely family made their way to the front. Silas felt every eye upon them, judging, wondering, perhaps even beginning to understand. Standing before their neighbors, Dinah lifted her chin proudly. "This is our Pa," she declared, her voice ringing clear as a bell through the hushed church. Josiah's grip tightened on Silas's hand. "God sent him to us," he added softly but firmly. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Silas felt tears burning behind his eyes as he bowed his head. "Dear Lord," he prayed, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't never deserved such blessing as these children. You found me alone and gave me purpose. You took my empty house and made it a home." His voice broke. "Thank you for the gift of family." Through his tears, Silas heard a small sound. He looked up to see Mrs. Porter, the stern schoolmistress, removing her glasses and dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Other faces in the congregation showed similar emotion, some wiping away tears, others nodding in understanding. Reverend Cobb placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said softly. "Sometimes he uses the smallest hands to build the strongest bridges." The winter wind howled outside, but inside Silas's cabin, warmth and contentment reigned. Each evening after supper, the small family gathered around the crackling hearth. Tonight, lamplight danced across worn Bible pages as Silas's finger traced each word carefully. "And the Lord is my shepherd," he read slowly, his deep voice steady in the quiet room. "I shall not want," Dinah and Josiah finished together, their faces glowing with pride at remembering the words. Josiah sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands busy with a piece of pine wood and his small whittling knife. Silas had taught him proper technique, guiding his fingers away from the blade. Now the boy worked with careful concentration, shaping what he insisted would become a fine horse for his sister. "See here, Dinah," he said, holding up his work. "This part will be the mane, flowing just like a real horse's." Dinah looked up from her mending, needle paused mid-stitch. "It's beautiful, Josiah. Will it gallop as fast as Pa's mule?" "Faster," Josiah declared with a grin. Silas set the Bible aside and picked up his comb. "Time for your hair, Dinah." She settled between his knees, patient as he separated her thick hair into sections. His fingers, more accustomed to setting traps and skinning game, fumbled with the delicate task of braiding. But each evening he tried again, determined to master this fatherly duty. "Ouch!" Dinah squeaked as he pulled too hard. "Sorry, child," he murmured, loosening his grip. "These old hands ain't made for such fine work." "You're getting better, Pa," she assured him. "Much better than last week." The next morning, Silas hitched the mule for their weekly trip to town. Snow lay thick on the trail, but the sky promised fair weather. At the general store, Silas felt the familiar weight of hostile stares. 3 ranchers huddled near the counter, their voices dropping to pointed whispers as he entered with the twins. "There's that hermit's brood," one muttered, just loud enough to hear. Silas straightened his spine, squaring his shoulders. Where once such words might have driven him back to his mountain solitude, now they slid off him like rain. He had 2 children to protect. Their needs mattered more than any man's spite. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," he said clearly to the shopkeeper. "We'll need sugar and coffee today." After loading their supplies, they stopped by the church to speak with Reverend Cobb. The preacher welcomed them into his study, where a pot of tea steamed on his desk. "Silas," Cobb said earnestly, "you need to file those adoption papers. Make it permanent, legal and binding. The children deserve that security." Silas's hands trembled slightly as he accepted a cup of tea. What if they find some reason to deny it? Some trick in the law? "The judge has seen your heart," Cobb assured him. "He's watched you nearly die to save your son. He's seen these children thrive under your care. Have faith, brother." On the ride home, snow began falling in lazy spirals. Dinah sat behind Silas on the mule, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. The steady clip-clop of hooves filled the peaceful afternoon. "Pa?" Dinah's voice was thoughtful. "Yes, child? God picked you for us, you know." She squeezed him tighter. He knew exactly who we needed. Silas tried to respond, but emotion closed his throat. He could only pat her hand where it rested against his coat, his heart too full for words. As they climbed the mountain trail toward home, he silently thanked God for the millionth time for sending two small children to knock on his door that stormy night. The adoption papers lay folded in his coat pocket, waiting to be filed. Tomorrow, he would ride into town alone and begin the process. His children deserved no less than his complete commitment, sealed by law as it was already sealed in his heart. Spring thaw dripped from the courthouse eaves as Silas stood before Judge Hargrave's bench. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the worn floorboards where Dinah and Josiah fidgeted in their Sunday best. The room smelled of leather and wood polish, filled with the low murmur of townsfolk who had gathered to witness the proceedings. Judge Hargrave's stern gaze followed Silas's weathered hand as he carefully signed each adoption paper. The scratch of the pen seemed loud in the hushed chamber. Silas formed each letter with deliberate care, knowing these marks would bind them together forever as family. "Your Honor," the rancher's voice cut through the quiet, "I must object one final time. This man Dash." But something had changed in the town. Where once his words might have sparked mutters of agreement, now they fell flat in the spring air. Several townsfolk shifted in their seats, frowning at the interruption. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, stood up. "That man," she said firmly, "rode through ice and snow to save his boy. Nearly died doing it, too." "Gave up his boots and watch for medicine," added Mr. Thompson, the livery stable owner. "Ain't many fathers would do the same." More voices joined in, each recounting Silas's acts of devotion. The rancher's face reddened as he sank back into his seat. Judge Hargrave's gavel cracked against wood. "The adoption is hereby finalized," he declared. "These children are now, in the eyes of both law and God, the son and daughter of Silas Boone." Dinah and Josiah launched themselves at Silas before the echo faded. His heart surging with joy, Silas did something he hadn't attempted since they first arrived. He gathered both children in his arms and lifted them high. His back protested, but he didn't care. His deep laugh rolled through the courthouse, startling even himself with its freedom. They spilled out onto the courthouse steps where spring sunshine warmed their faces. The river rushed past the town, its waters finally free of ice. Silas held his children close, watching the flowing water that had nearly claimed his life months ago. "You know," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I spent years thinking no one wanted this old hermit. Reckon God had different plans all along." The twins squeezed him tighter, and Silas felt the last walls around his heart crumble away. Here, in the spring warmth, with his children in his arms, he was finally truly home. Silas ran his hand along the fresh-hewn pine boards of the new table he'd built, wide enough for 3 plates with room to spare. The scent of wood shavings still hung sweet in the air. Through the window, he watched Dinah and Josiah working in the freshly tilled garden plot beside the cabin. "Like this, sister?" Josiah asked, carefully dropping seeds into the shallow furrows. "That's right," Dinah replied, following behind to pat dark earth over each one. "Pa says they need a blanket of soil to grow strong." Their laughter drifted across the meadow where spring flowers dotted the thawing ground. Silas marveled at how the land itself seemed to have awakened from a long slumber, much like his own heart. As dusk approached, hoofbeats announced an unexpected visitor. The schoolmistress, Miss Warner, rode up looking nervous but determined. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle. "These are for the children," she said softly, revealing primers and slate boards. "I was wrong before, Mr. Boone. Every child deserves learning." Silas accepted with a gracious nod, calling the twins inside. They gathered around their new table, faces bright with excitement over their first lesson. That evening at supper, Dinah's clear voice rose in prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for making us a family." Lamplight warmed their faces as they shared bread and stew, the cabin walls echoing with gentle laughter where silence had lived too long. Sunlight streamed through the church windows as Silas walked up the aisle, his weathered hands holding tight to Dinah and Josiah. Their Sunday best might have been simple, but their faces shone with pride as they took their place in the front pew. The usual whispers that followed them had softened to warm smiles. Reverend Cobb stood at his pulpit, his lined face gentle as he opened his Bible. "Today we speak of Psalm 68, he said, voice carrying to the rafters. How our Lord sets the solitary in families. His knowing glance fell on Silas and the twins. When the organ wheezed into amazing grace, Dinah and Josiah's clear voices lifted without hesitation. Silas joined them, his deep baritone blending with their sweet tones. The harmony filled every corner of the little church. Tears glistened in Reverend Cobb's eyes as he watched them sing. Even the hard-faced ranchers who had once opposed Silas bowed their heads in respect. As the final notes faded, Silas looked down at his children. Love radiated from their upturned faces. His throat tightened with emotion. He who had lived so long alone, believing himself unwanted, now stood tall before his neighbors, chosen by God, chosen by these precious children, blessed with the family he had never dared to dream of. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.